Kirsten is Engagement Manager within Biosecurity Queensland, a long-term member of the National Biosecurity Communications and Engagement Network, and she's one of Australia's top thinkers in biosecurity communications and engagement. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you, Steph, for that introduction. I'm just waiting for my PowerPoint to load. Just 1 second. Excellent. Thank you, Steph. And thanks, Maxine, for that great presentation. I think how this is all coming together at the moment in terms of what we're learning and what we're seeing with our biosecurity behaviour change is really exciting. Before I delve into this presentation, I just wanted to, I guess, set the scene in terms of where we are now with our behavioural insights. So at the Partners Forum in 2018, all of you as our stakeholders who were there voted on the 22 priorities, and behaviour change research came out as the #1 priority at that forum. So since that time, biosecurity has invested significantly in capturing and gathering information and behavioural science results, some of which were presented in 2019 at the 2019 Partners Forum. Maxine's just given us a great overview and some insights into those, some of that research again as well. We're at the point now where we've analysed all of those results. We've also looked more widely, so we've looked across government agencies, across partner groups who are doing this research. We've looked nationally at what's available and pulled all of that together. What we wanted this research to inform is basically how do we move from having this research into behaviour change priorities, which we can then turn into action. So basically it's about where the rubber hits the road. How do we make this research work for us in terms of changing how we do engagement and how we do behaviour change work on the ground with our stakeholders? So our drivers for change have been that behavioural science was the highest priority voted by our partners. We also have multiple overlapping biosecurity threats. So you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of biosecurity threats in terms of pests and diseases out there that we're combating. So how do we decide where we put our energies? We also have crowded communication channels, and as Steph has just highlighted, biosecurity is not top of mind for a lot of people. So how do we get that cut through with the people that we need to reach? We have finite budgets. We also have very diverse audiences. And the other thing is that prevention isn't where our focus is. So a lot of our time and energy, as has been highlighted in this forum already, goes into that response and management type work. So how do we get our focus back on the prevention? So many of you would have seen this before, but this is the invasion curve when we talk about biosecurity. And where we want to be putting our efforts is basically cutting off our biosecurity threats and issues in the prevention space, so to the left of the invasion curve. If we can put our efforts in there and make a real difference there, in the longer term, it's going to reduce the costs and impacts on our stakeholders on the ground in not having to manage long-term biosecurity issues. So we really want to put some effort into that prevention space. So in terms of the inputs for change, we've pulled together a whole raft of work to bring together some behaviour change priorities, which I'll talk you through shortly. But we've looked at our behaviour change research. We've also done a mapping exercise of the national priority pest and disease threats, and I'll talk you through that shortly as well. We've run some focus groups with some of our biosecurity engagement gurus. We've done a literature review, so looked right across the country. We've had engagement with other jurisdictions. So as Steph mentioned, I'm part of the National Communication and Engagement Network, and we talk regularly about how we can work better in this prevention space. And we also looked at some of our response management reviews and how they can inform where we go with our behaviour change priorities. So what our research has told us is that what happens now in the biosecurity space and around biosecurity threats is that we invest heavily in particular pests and diseases. So, for example, ASF is a current threat on our doorstep, so we invest heavily in African swine fever. Capra beetle, previously foot and mouth disease, varroa mite. So depending on what the current threat is or the current incident is where we invest our funding, but it is also where we invest our time in terms of targeting biosecurity behaviours. What we're not getting is a broad base of general biosecurity awareness and improved biosecurity behaviour change that cut across all of the pests and diseases. Obviously, there are a lot of behaviours that could be targeted. So we've gone through a process where we've tried to narrow down those behaviours to the key ones that we think will have the most impact across all biosecurity pests and diseases. The other thing that happens is, as I said, when we get these pests and diseases, I guess the behaviour change work that we do is very focused on that particular pest and disease. So instead of investing at that time when there's a heightened awareness about biosecurity in all of the behaviours that might surround that particular pest, we invest in particular behaviours around it. So for example, for Capra beetle, we invest in particular behaviours that relate to the behaviours of Capra beetle. What we don't do is use that opportunity to talk about hitchhiker pests more generally and how we can change behaviours around all hitchhiker pests while we have that raised level of awareness. So one of the things that we did is we looked at the national biosecurity threats and behaviour and looked at how we might map behaviour change over these. So we looked at the national animal disease threats, so the top priority animal diseases nationally. We looked at the plant pests. We looked at the national environmental pests and diseases list. We also looked at the Queensland invasive plants and animals priority list, and we also looked at the highest risk priorities that were mapped through the previous biosecurity capability project. What we did when we looked at all of these lists and we pulled together some of our biosecurity experts within BQ to look at these, we looked at the vectors and pathways for the pests and diseases. We looked at the highest risk behaviours associated with those. We also looked at the positive behaviours. So, okay, we've got the negative behaviours that people might be displaying, but what are the proactive or preventative behaviours that we want people to adhere to? And then we looked at some of the highest risk audiences. So once we mapped that across all of these pest and disease lists, we came out with some commonalities around the highest risk behaviours and the highest risk audiences. The other thing that we took into account were threats by geography. So there were some teams in here that did some work about looking at where biosecurity incidents had occurred, where they may be likely to occur, and we took that into account as well. So the list there shows where the rankings were, probably no surprises in terms of Cape York and far north Queensland and the Gulf being a high priority. But we also looked at areas like where threats could present around high risk entry points. So your ports and airports and the like were also a high risk geographic area. So what we did is we combined all of these results. So we looked at our behavioural research, so a lot of what Maxine has touched on. We looked at our national threats list. We also looked at our geographic threats, and we've come up with 6 strategic biosecurity behaviour change priorities. So the first of these is on-farm biosecurity plans, so that we want people to have them in place and in action. So it isn't just paperwork that sits on a shelf, it's actually a process that they have in place as an active, I guess, biosecurity protection on their properties. There are a few key things that came up underneath this that were high priority behaviours to change. So inappropriate feeding of animals, weed seed spread, habitat crossover, which was basically wild animals interacting with production animals, and then a human health crossover. So that was our first behaviour change priority. The second was around identifying the unusual, and then converting that into biosecurity pest and disease reporting. So this was around increasing our passive surveillance and citizen science. In discussing this through the various forums, the Spotted Anything Unusual campaign, which AHA continues to run, continues to come up as a really well-recognised campaign. It also cuts across into the plant and invasive space as well. The other thing that came up is getting education out there on what's normal so that people can determine what's not normal. And then the big one was reducing the barriers to reporting. So understanding what those barriers are to reporting. That could be ego, people not feeling like we have the ability to respond, confusion over who to report to and the like. The next one was around hitchhiker pests. So the Australian government currently run a program around this called Look Secure Report, but we definitely need to do more in this space, and this was a really big behaviour change threat in terms of getting people to look for these hitchhiker pests and report them. So that early detection was critical. The highest priority audiences that came out were around the major retailers and around the geographic hotspots and also the supply chain. Just on this one, there has been a lot of discussion, and we know states like New South Wales are looking at adopting a program around this. Was around educating those particularly high major retail organisations, educating their staff about what to look for hitchhiker pests. So as I said, that early detection, being able to identify what's unusual and then being motivated to report that. So we're talking about things like an education package, for example, for the major retailers that they can run online with their staff. We know these organisations are sophisticated in the training they require their staff to do. So your likes of Bunnings and things like that require staff to do ongoing training. So how do we get biosecurity education into their current structures to make it front of mind for their staff when they're opening packaging that's come from overseas? The fourth one is around come clean, go clean. So this links quite a bit back to the on-farm biosecurity planning, but it also crosses over into the environmental and aquatic space very heavily. So again, what can be done in this space to raise that behaviour consideration and get good biosecurity behaviours around that? Number 5 was around movement restrictions. Soil in particular was a priority when we looked across all of those threats. And the other thing that we've noticed is that with the significant domestic movement now, so we before it was a lot of international movement, and there is still product coming in, but we don't have the tourist movement that we had previously in terms of internationals, but we have much more domestic movement. So the potential for pests and diseases to be moved with the increase in domestic travel. And then the last one was about keeping releasing plants and animals that present a biosecurity risk. So this was around people buying things like cacti and other plant pests and the like at markets, people buying online, people buying pets online, anything from, giant African snails to rabbits, and either bringing that in from overseas or moving it domestically. Aquatic came up as a high priority in here as well, and the opportunity for online awareness and compliance opportunities is high within this space too. So just to run through the audiences, so these were our highest priority audiences that came up. So there was obviously the geographic ones that I've talked about, the environmental sector and being able to forge stronger links there, the large retail importers that I've talked about. The peri-urban semi-production group came up very strongly. And when we talked about this in looking at all of these bodies of research, we defined the peri-urbans as our highest risk being the semi-production peri-urbans. So it's not necessarily someone that's got 20 chickens in their backyard. It's people who have, enough chickens in their backyard that they're then selling to markets or selling locally and things like that. So they're the ones that presented the highest risk. And then free range operators also came up highly. In terms of the key messaging outcomes, and Maxine touched on some of these in that review of the research as well, what resonates is people, partnerships and profile. The other thing that we have learned from our experiences and in looking at this research is that we need to reinforce the positive behaviours. So we need to take a holistic approach. And White Spot was a great example of that. So it wasn't just about telling people they couldn't use imported prawns as bait. We actually had to develop a whole avenue for people to go, well, you can't use imported prawns as bait, but here are all the options that you can use for bait and to catch bait and use bait that are going to be a better biosecurity outcome. Motivational drivers are key. So we talk a lot about the macro motivational drivers. So we talk about the $17 billion a year industry, but what actually resonates with people are the lifestyle impacts, their livelihood impacts, and their environmental conscience. And they're the levers that we need to use in our messaging. We need to move away from compliance-focused messaging. Yes, there is a place for compliance, but we definitely need those positive messages, and we need to be really clear on our call to action. And again, Maxine touched on this in terms of people need to understand exactly what we want them to do. So where to from here? Hopefully what both Maxine and I have presented today underpins some of the workshop discussions later today. We're very keen to finalise our priorities and then build some priority projects around these that work in partnership between stakeholders and government. We want to have a clear content strategy. So what are our clear messages around these priority behaviours? And then we need to look at funding options. How are we going to deliver this sort of program of behaviour change work? So that's it from me, Steph, but happy to take questions online. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. You can really see how the behavioural insights are underpinning this action plan, and certainly a lot of food for thought, as you said, in this afternoon's workshops.